The barracks of the Zizareth war fleet was a place of discipline, order, and ruthless efficiency. The soldiers who gathered there were among the most fearsome warriors in the known galaxy, veterans of countless battles, conquerors of entire worlds. They did not fear death, nor did they believe in anything that could not be explained by logic and science. The Empire had long eradicated superstitions, considering them remnants of weak and primitive minds. Victory belonged to strength, strategy, and superior technology, not to whispers of the unknown. Tonight, the air inside the barracks was thick with laughter, deep and guttural, rolling through the steel chambers like the low growl of an approaching storm. The warriors were exchanging stories, tales of battles fought against lesser species, of planets scorched and civilizations brought to their knees. It was a ritual among them, boasting of their victories, reliving their triumphs. One of the younger warriors, a soldier named Varric, leaned forward with a grin, his fangs glinting in the dim overhead lighting. "Have you ever heard the things humans believe in?" he asked, his voice filled with amusement. "They speak of ghosts, of spirits haunting their dead. They have tales of creatures lurking in the dark, waiting to snatch them away. They even tell stories of ancient gods who walk among them, unseen but powerful," he scoffed, shaking his head. "The same race that dares to challenge us in battle still fears the shadows like frightened children." Another soldier, a burly brute named Koresh, chuckled and slammed his fist against the metal table. "I heard one of their prisoners whisper about something called demons before I crushed his skull. He truly believed such nonsense, as if invisible monsters could be more terrifying than the blades of the Zizareth." The room erupted in laughter again, the sound echoing through the reinforced steel walls. The warriors took pleasure in ridiculing the weaknesses of their enemies, and humans had proven to be the most entertaining of them all. Despite their surprising resilience and ability to adapt, they clung to these ridiculous notions, weaving fear into their own existence. It was pathetic. At the far end of the room, sitting apart from the others, was Commander Koranva. He had not spoken a word throughout their exchange, had not even glanced up from the small device he was methodically adjusting. His presence alone was enough to command respect. A veteran of wars so brutal that even the most hardened warriors spoke of them in hushed tones. He had faced horrors on the battlefield that few could imagine. His body bore the scars of those battles. Deep, jagged lines across his thick skin, a mechanical arm replacing the one he had lost, an eye that glowed dimly from an artificial implant. Varric, emboldened by the approval of his fellow soldiers, turned his attention to the silent commander. "What about you, Koranva?" he asked, leaning back in his seat. "Surely you've fought humans enough to hear their foolish beliefs. What do you make of their myths?" The room fell quiet. Even those who had been mid-conversation turned to look at the commander, waiting for his response. It was rare for Koranva to entertain their discussions, and they were eager to hear his thoughts. For a long moment he said nothing. He continued to adjust the device in his hand, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he set it down and exhaled slowly, his voice low but carrying the weight of something unspoken. "You laugh," he said, "because you have never seen what I have seen." The shift in the room was instant. The amusement drained from the soldiers' faces, replaced by something else: curiosity, uncertainty, perhaps even the first flickering of unease. Koranva rarely spoke without purpose. If he was sharing a story, it was not to entertain, it was to warn. He leaned forward, his single organic eye scanning the room, settling on each soldier as if measuring whether they were ready to hear what he had to say. Then, in a voice laced with something none of them could quite place, he began. "There was a war, long before many of you took up arms for the Empire. A war that was meant to be swift, decisive. We had discovered a human colony on a desolate world, isolated from their main forces. Our orders were simple: eliminate them, take the planet, leave no survivors. It was supposed to be easy." His fingers curled against the metal table, his grip tightening. But it was not. The barracks was utterly silent now, the tension thick as the soldiers listened, drawn into the story despite themselves. We arrived in overwhelming numbers. Our ships surrounded the planet, cutting off all escape routes. Our weapons were superior, our warriors unmatched. Yet, from the moment we landed, something was wrong. The scanners began to fail, readings fluctuated, as if the very air was resisting our technology. We dismissed it as environmental interference, but then we heard them. His voice lowered, forcing the soldiers to lean in. Whispers, not over the comms, not in our helmets, inside our heads. At first we thought it was a malfunction, a trick of the mind, but the whispers did not stop. They grew louder, clearer. They spoke our names. They knew us. The younger soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence beginning to waver. Korinva's expression darkened. Then we found the first body, one of our own, his face frozen in terror, his body twisted unnaturally. There was no sign of a struggle, no burns from weapons, no wounds that made sense, only deep, jagged marks, as if something had torn through him, something that did not belong in this world. A shiver ran through the room. The laughter from earlier seemed distant, irrelevant. We set up a perimeter, expecting an attack, but nothing came, no human forces, no resistance. Only the whispers remained, growing louder with every passing hour. Soldiers started to disappear. Some wandered off into the dark as if answering a call only they could hear. Others simply vanished, their weapons left behind, their armor intact, but no trace of them remained. He exhaled, his mechanical fingers tapping against the table. I do not know what we fought that night. I do not know if we fought anything at all. All I know is that by dawn, my unit was gone. Every last warrior, every last shipmate. Only I remained, and the only thing I carried back with me was this. He lifted his sleeve, revealing a long, jagged scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow, the flesh around it slightly discolored. I did not receive this from a weapon. I did not receive this from any enemy we know, and to this day, I do not know what it was. The barracks was colder now. The laughter had long since faded, replaced by an eerie silence that no one dared to break. Even Varric, who had been so quick to mock the humans, looked pale, his usual arrogance subdued. Korinvo leaned back, his single organic eye locking onto each of them once more. You call them myths, he said. But tell me, why do the humans fear them too? No one spoke. No one laughed. The whispers of their own thoughts were the only sounds they could hear. The shuttle descended through the dense atmosphere, its hull trembling slightly under the pressure of the planet's thick, stagnant air. Korinva watched through the reinforced viewport as the surface below grew clearer. Dark, barren plains stretched for miles, broken only by jagged mountain ridges and deep, unnatural crevices. The human base was somewhere in the distance, hidden among the dead landscape. The operation was supposed to be a swift eradication. His unit had landed with overwhelming numbers, outgunning the small human outpost. No reinforcements were expected, no escape was possible. By the time the sun rose over this wasteland, the Empire would claim another victory. But something was wrong. The first sign of trouble came long before they touched the ground. The planetary scans had been unreliable, constantly shifting between static interference and false readings. What had started as a minor annoyance soon turned into a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The terrain itself seemed inconsistent, as if shifting under an unseen force. His second-in-command, Captain Varesh, had dismissed it as an error in the ship's systems, but Korinva wasn't so sure. When the ship's landing gear finally met solid ground, the silence was suffocating. No sounds of wildlife, no distant hum of wind, just an oppressive stillness that settled over them like an unseen force. He stepped onto the planet's surface, his boots sinking slightly into the dry, cracked ground. The rest of the unit followed, disciplined and silent, their weapons drawn, their formations precise. The human outpost was several kilometers away. Their scouts had been deployed ahead, disappearing into the shadows of the mountains. The communication line remained open, but the voices on the other end were unnerving. Cold static laced between their reports. as if something unseen was brushing against the signal. Voresh, walking beside him, let out a low, irritated breath. The humans should have detected our approach by now. There are no patrols, no movement. They are either preparing an ambush or— A sharp burst of static interrupted him, followed by a distorted voice from one of the scouts. "Commander, we—" The message cut off abruptly. Korenva lifted a hand, signaling for a halt. Every soldier froze in place, scanning the surroundings. He activated his communicator, his voice steady. "Repeat your last transmission." Only silence answered. Voresh frowned, glancing at the other officers. "Comms failure?" Korenva shook his head. "No. Something is interfering." The wind shifted suddenly, or at least he thought it did. There was no actual breeze, no stirring of the dust beneath their feet, yet a pressure rolled through the air, a deep, crawling sensation that settled at the base of his skull. His muscles tensed instinctively, though he could not yet explain why. Then, from the far ridge ahead, a scout emerged. Korenva exhaled through his nose, relieved for only a moment before he noticed the unnatural way the soldier moved. His steps were slow, rigid, as if his body was fighting against itself. His head was slightly tilted to the side, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. Something was wrong. "Report," Korenva ordered, keeping his voice sharp. The soldier did not answer. Korenva signaled Voresh to move forward, weapons still lowered but ready to fire at the first sign of threat. The captain took several steps ahead, stopping within meters of the scout. He reached out to grip the soldier's shoulder, shaking him slightly. "Speak! What happened?" The scout's head snapped up suddenly, his face twisting into something that should have been impossible. His eyes were wide, bulging with terror, his mouth slightly parted, as if he were trying to scream but had lost the ability to do so. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, his body trembling violently. And then he collapsed. Korenvu moved quickly, kneeling beside the fallen soldier while others surrounded them, weapons now raised. He gripped the scout's armor, turning him onto his back. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. His skin, though not truly like human flesh, had turned ashen, his veins dark and raised as if something had burrowed beneath them. Korenva's voice was low. "What happened to you?" The soldier's lips parted slightly, his throat working as if trying to form words. The sound that finally escaped was not a language. It was a breath, a whisper, something that sent a chill through every warrior present. "They are not gone." His fingers clenched around Korenva's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong despite his failing body. His eyes flickered, unfocused, filled with something more than fear. "Who?" Korenva pressed. The soldier inhaled sharply, his body seizing for a moment before his muscles went slack. The grip on Korenva's wrist loosened. His chest stopped rising. "Dead." Voresh stepped back, his face tight with unease. His body shows no wounds, no signs of battle. He died of something," Korenva interrupted, his voice grim. "Something that does not need weapons." The soldiers around them were tense, shifting slightly, their grip tightening on their rifles. The enemy had not fired a single shot, had not even shown themselves, yet one of their own was dead. And then the static returned. This time, it was different. It came in waves, rising and falling, a sound that almost resembled voices. It was layered, overlapping, low murmurs beneath the interference, distant but growing closer. The soldiers stiffened, some tilting their heads as if straining to make out the words hidden within the noise. Korenva listened, not because he wanted to, but because he felt something in the sound, something he recognized, a whisper, a memory long buried beneath years of war. It spoke his name. He shot to his feet, scanning the ridge. The sun was lowering now, casting long shadows over the cracked terrain, but there was no movement, no sign of anything living. only the faint traces of human structures in the distance, the ruins of their outpost waiting in eerie silence. He turned to his unit, his voice sharp. "We move forward, stay together, no one wanders." Varesh hesitated for only a second before nodding, barking out orders to the others. The formation shifted, falling into a tighter perimeter as they advanced toward the base. With each step, the silence deepened, and the whispers grew louder. The formation advanced in near silence, the rhythmic clanking of their armored boots the only real sound beyond the whispers that still bled through the comms. The human outpost loomed in the distance, its structure standing eerily intact despite the unnatural stillness surrounding it. The dim, failing light of the setting sun stretched their shadows long across the cracked terrain, distorting their figures into shifting, elongated shapes that seemed almost separate from their own bodies. Corenval walked at the head of the unit, his senses razor-sharp, his grip firm around the hilt of his plasma blade. The rifle slung across his back was a formality now. Whatever had killed the scout had not done so with conventional weapons. He could feel it, an oppressive force pressing at the edges of his consciousness, a slow, deliberate pressure like unseen hands testing the limits of his mind. He clenched his jaw and pushed forward. Varesh walked beside him, silent now, the arrogance from earlier drained from his posture. His shoulders were stiff, his gaze flickering between the looming outpost and the horizon behind them as if he expected something to be following. The other warriors were just as tense. Their formation remained tight, but the usual precision was gone, replaced with something Corenval hated. The last transmission from the scout unit had come from just outside the outpost walls, but there was no sign of them. No bodies, no weapons, nothing but the faint disturbances in the dust where their boots should have left tracks. It was as if the ground itself had swallowed them whole. He stopped at the threshold of the main entrance, the metal doors slightly ajar. A deep gash ran across the thick steel plating, but the edges of the cut were uneven, almost organic in shape, as if something had melted through rather than blasted its way inside. The sight set his nerves on edge. He raised a fist, signaling for silence. The unit stilled instantly. With a careful, deliberate motion, he pushed against the heavy door. It groaned as it slid open, revealing a corridor bathed in dim emergency lighting, the flickering bulbs casting erratic shadows against the metallic walls. The air inside smelled stale, tinged with something acrid, something that burned faintly in his lungs. It was not just decay. It was something older. He motioned for Varesh to move forward first, and the captain obeyed, stepping through the threshold with his rifle raised, scanning the darkness ahead. Corenval followed, his warriors pressing in behind him, their movements measured and precise. The corridor led deeper into the outpost, past empty storage crates and overturned equipment. The walls were lined with human symbols, warnings written in their crude script, but the words had been smeared, obscured by something that had dripped down from above. He ran a clawed finger along one of the walls, inspecting the dark residue. It was thick, half-dried, the color almost indistinguishable in the dim lighting. Not human blood. The silence grew heavier the deeper they went. It was not the silence of an abandoned structure, not the stillness of a lifeless place. It was the kind of silence that listened back. He saw the first body slumped against a terminal near the center of what had once been the command room. A human soldier, his uniform torn, his helmet cracked down the middle. His arms hung limply at his sides, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His face was frozen in a grotesque expression, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. His skin was marred with deep grooves, as if something had pressed into his flesh and left its mark. Varesh knelt beside the corpse, inspecting the wounds. No energy burns, no projectile damage. His voice was quiet, clipped. This was not a battle. Corenval crouched beside him, studying the body closer. The wounds were symmetrical, deliberate. This was not the work of panic or a struggle. This was something precise, something methodical. He turned his attention to the human's hands. The fingertips were bloodied, the nails cracked and broken. He had not died instantly. The whispers through the comms surged, distorting, growing louder before cutting off in a sharp burst of static. A moment later, the emergency lights flickered violently before stabilizing again, casting the room back into dim, flickering illumination. Then, the sound of movement. Not a breath, not a voice. Just a shift in the air, a displacement so slight it would have been imperceptible if not for the sheer weight of the silence it disturbed. The warriors turned sharply, weapons raised. The corridor behind them remained empty, but Corin knew better than to trust his eyes. He rose slowly, scanning the room. The walls were marked with more of the dark residue, smeared across the terminals, streaking the floor in erratic patterns. This was not just death. This was something else. Varesh straightened beside him, eyes narrowing. Something is still here. Corin exhaled through his nose. No, he murmured. Something never left. The room was no longer empty. It had never been empty. Something had always been watching, and now it was moving. Whoa! The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Corin felt it before he saw it. A ripple in the air, a distortion of space just beyond the dim glow of the emergency lighting. He turned his head slightly, his instincts sharper than his sight, his breath steady despite the growing pressure pressing against his mind. His soldiers remained frozen, their weapons aimed at the empty corridor behind them, the tension in their bodies so tight it seemed as if a single wrong breath would shatter them. The silence held for only a moment longer before the lights flickered once again, plunging the room into near darkness. The glow from the soldiers' visors cast eerie reflections across the steel walls, shifting and stretching as the darkness seemed to move with them. Corin grip tightened around his plasma blade, the weapon humming faintly in his grasp. Then the sound came, a whisper. No, not a single whisper, multiple voices, overlapping, surrounding them. It was not the interference from their comms this time. It was here, in the room. Varesh inhaled sharply, his head snapping toward the far end of the chamber where the light barely touched the walls. His stance shifted slightly, as if his body was preparing for something unseen. Corin followed his gaze and, for a brief moment, he saw it. A shape. Or the absence of one. It was not a shadow, nor was it a creature he could define. It was something between the spaces, something that should not have been there, something that did not belong in the world of solid matter and logic. It shifted, its outline barely distinguishable from the darkness that surrounded it, but he knew it was watching. The whispers grew louder. Corin did not hesitate. He moved swiftly, his plasma blade slicing through the air toward the distortion. The energy pulsed against the emptiness, and for a fraction of a second the form flickered, revealing something beneath the veil of the unseen. He caught a glimpse, a flash of something grotesque, something wrong. The thing recoiled, and then it was gone. But the room was no safer. The darkness itself had changed. The walls no longer felt solid, the air no longer felt still. A presence had settled within the chamber, pressing against the very fabric of reality. Corin could feel the weight of unseen eyes boring into his back, watching from places he could not define. A soldier to his left made a sound, something between a gasp and a strangled breath. Corin turned just in time to see him step backward, his fingers twitching slightly, his rifle lowering ever so slightly as his eyes went wide. Then, with no sound, no warning, he was pulled into the dark. Not thrown, not dragged, pulled, as if the space around him had simply folded, swallowing him whole. Varesh cursed under his breath, his voice strained but controlled. His grip on his weapon remained firm, though his muscles were tense, his stance shifting in unease. "We need to move," he muttered. Corin did not respond immediately. He was still staring at the spot where the soldier had stood. The darkness had swallowed him without hesitation, without struggle. He had simply ceased to exist in the space he once occupied. There had been no scream, no sound of a body striking the ground, only the absence of presence. "Fall back," Coronva ordered finally, his voice steady despite the unnatural pressure in the air. "Regroup outside." The remaining soldiers obeyed without hesitation. Their formation shifted as they moved toward the exit, their backs never turning fully away from the void that had opened around them. The emergency lights flickered again, dimming further with every passing second. The outpost was collapsing into something it was never meant to be, a place of silence, a place of things unseen. As Coronva took the final steps toward the threshold, he felt it again. The whisper. But this time it was not his name. It was something older, a word he did not understand, a word that did not belong to any language spoken by man or beast, and yet he knew it. Somewhere, deep within his mind, buried beneath years of war and logic, he knew what it meant, a warning or a threat, or perhaps both. He did not look back. He did not need to. Something in the dark was smiling. The soldiers emerged from the outpost into the dim, fading light of the planet's surface, their movements tense, their formations tight. The air felt heavier now, as if the weight of something unseen had pressed down upon the world itself, altering its very atmosphere. The whispers had faded the moment they stepped beyond the walls, but the sensation of being watched had not. Coronva did not allow himself to look back. He had learned long ago that some things were not meant to be seen twice. The outpost loomed behind them, its structure seemingly intact, but he knew better. That place no longer existed in the way it once had. It had become something else, something neither dead nor alive, something that had swallowed one of his men without a sound. Varesh was breathing heavily, his grip tight on his rifle, though he had not fired a single shot. He was a seasoned warrior, but there was nothing in his training that had prepared him for this. None of them had been trained for this. Coronval lifted his communicator, switching to the fleet's secured channel. "This is Commander Coronva," he said, his voice steady despite the unnatural cold in his bones. "The mission is compromised. Evacuation required immediately." Static answered him. Not silence. Static. The same layered distortion that had bled through their comms inside the outpost. His grip tightened, his teeth clenched. The fleet should have responded instantly, but there was no reply. No acknowledgement, only static. And then, through the distortion, something else. Not words. Breathing. Deep, slow, deliberate. A presence that did not belong. Coronva shut off the communicator. There was no point. The message had been received, but not by the fleet. Varesh turned to him, his expression rigid, his voice controlled. "We are not alone." Coronva nodded. He had known that from the moment he set foot on this planet. The whispers had been warning them all along, not telling them to leave. No, it had never been that simple. The voices had not begged. They had not pleaded. They had been waiting. The outpost was not a trap. The entire planet was. Something moved beyond the ridge, a ripple in the air, subtle but undeniable, a distortion, bending the space around it. It was not cloaking technology. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was something else. The warriors raised their weapons, but Coronva already knew it would not matter. He had fought enemies of flesh and steel, but this was neither. The thing did not approach them. It watched. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Not vanished, gone, as if it had never existed in the first place. The silence stretched between them, suffocating, endless. Then the communicator crackled. A voice. A familiar voice. "The mission is compromised. Evacuation required immediately." His voice, his exact words, but he had not spoken them. His blood ran cold. Varesh stiffened beside him, his hand flexing slightly against the grip of his rifle. "Commander?" Coronva exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening. The thing had learned. It had taken something from him. His voice, his words. And if it could do that, then it had taken more than just a soldier in the dark. It had taken knowledge. The fleet would respond. They would send reinforcements, and the thing would wait. He turned sharply, his voice cutting through the cold air. We leave, now. Varesh hesitated for only a moment before nodding. The remaining soldiers moved without question, their steps quick but controlled. The shadows stretched as they made their way back toward the extraction point. The light was dimming faster than it should have, as if the very sun had begun to sink into the void that had swallowed the outpost. Korenva did not know what had existed on this planet before the humans built their colony. He did not know what had been awakened by their presence, what had learned from them, what had adapted. But he knew one thing. This was no longer a battlefield. This was something else entirely. And the Empire would never understand, not until it was too late. The first transmission from the fleet finally came through as they neared the extraction site. A clean, strong signal. The commanding officer on the other end spoke, his tone crisp, unaware of the horror that had taken place. Commander Korenva, we received your distress call. Reinforcements are on their way. Korenva closed his eyes briefly. The thing had spoken in his voice. The reinforcements were already too late.